"Stay a while," she said softly, not looking at me, her voice barely louder than the hum of the ceiling fan overhead. Just 3 words, but they landed in the center of my chest, quiet and heavy, like the way summer heat sits still after a long rain. I had 1 foot out the door, keys in my hand, sweat still drying on the back of my neck from lifting boxes all morning. I was supposed to be heading home. Back to my empty apartment, back to the silence I pretended didn't bother me. But the way she said it didn't feel like a request. It felt like a confession. Her name was Elise. She was my mother's friend, the kind of woman who carried herself like she'd lived 10 lives and was tired of explaining any of them. Mid-30s, maybe early 40s, though I'd never dared to ask. She'd been renting the old house next to my mom's for a few years now, the one with the ivy crawling up the sides and the peeling blue shutters that always looked a little sad, even in sunlight. I never paid her much attention before, not until Mom asked if I could help her move. I told myself it was just a favor, just boxes, just a Saturday morning. But as soon as I stepped into her home, something shifted. The air inside was different, lived in, quiet, filled with the smell of lavender and dust and something slightly citrus I couldn't name, like a place that had held its breath too long. She greeted me with a tired smile, eyes smudged with something that wasn't quite makeup and wasn't quite sleep. "I didn't expect you so early," she said, brushing hair from her face with the back of her wrist. I almost apologized, but the way she said it, no annoyance, just surprise, made me feel like maybe she was glad I came. We started with the kitchen, plates wrapped in newspaper, mugs carefully tucked into old towels. I watched the way her fingers moved. Precise, gentle. Like every object held a memory she hadn't quite let go of. She didn't talk much, but when she did, her voice had this low, almost melodic tone, like a song you half remember from childhood. I asked if she was moving far. "Just across town," she said, lifting a box and wincing slightly. "New chapter. Smaller space. Less to worry about." I nodded, though I didn't know what that meant. Less to worry about. She said it like it hurt. Outside, the sun pushed through. Clouds and a breeze moved through the overgrown garden like a sigh. We carried boxes in and out, making slow trips between the porch and the truck. At one point she laughed, really laughed, when a stack of books toppled over and knocked a glass bowl off the counter. It shattered, and she just stood there, barefoot in the glass, laughing like she hadn't in years. I didn't know what to do, so I laughed too. Then I grabbed a broom. Around noon, I offered to pick up lunch. She told me she wasn't hungry. Then, a few minutes later, she made us grilled cheese and tomato soup. We sat on the kitchen floor because the chairs were already packed. Her legs were folded beneath her, and I couldn't stop noticing how the sunlight slipped through the dusty window and landed in her hair like gold. She asked me about my work. I told her I was in between things, which was a nicer way of saying I was drifting. She didn't judge, just nodded like she understood that kind of in-between. We packed in silence after that. Hours passed in a rhythm. The creak of floorboards, the scrape of cardboard, the quiet sighs she tried to hide. I started to recognize the pattern of her, the way she touched things gently, the way she paused before sealing each box, like she was saying goodbye to more than objects. By the time we finished, it was late afternoon. The sky had turned that washed-out blue that comes before rain, and the truck was nearly full. I stood by the door, ready to leave, feeling that strange ache that comes from doing something kind for someone who didn't expect kindness. Then she said it. "Stay a while." I turned to look at her. Her eyes were tired, but not from the work. From something deeper. Something quiet and long-lived. She looked at me the way people look at doorways they aren't sure they're allowed to open. I didn't answer. I just stepped back inside. She poured wine into 2 mismatched glasses, the kind with chips at the rim, and we sat on the porch as the first drops of rain began to fall. The sky opened slowly, gently, like it was trying not to wake anyone. I listened to the soft patter against the leaves, the creak of the porch swing, the slow breath she took as she leaned back and closed her eyes. We didn't say much, but something passed between us. Not electricity, not desire, something older than that. Recognition, maybe. A knowing. And as the rain came down and the boxes sat quiet in the truck, I realized I wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Maybe not for a while. The days that followed blurred into something soft and strangely necessary. I hadn't meant to come back after that first evening, but I found myself there again the next morning. Under the excuse of helping her patch a leaky pipe in the bathroom, she greeted me with that same surprised half-smile and a towel wrapped around her damp hair. "Thought you'd be long gone," she said. I told her I had nowhere better to be. She handed me a cup of coffee in a chipped mug with a faded sunflower on it. "It's instant," she warned, as if that somehow dulled the warmth I felt when our fingers brushed. The pipe didn't take long, but I lingered anyway. She had a way of letting silence stretch without making it uncomfortable. I stayed through the afternoon, tightening screws in her bookshelves, rehanging a few crooked frames. She pulled weeds in the garden, and I joined her, though I knew nothing about plants. Her hands were always in the dirt, always tending to something, even when she didn't speak. I admired the quiet focus she carried, like she'd learned long ago that speaking wasn't always worth the cost. There was something peaceful about the way we moved around each other. I'd walk in through the side door without knocking, and she'd glance up from the kitchen table, maybe offer me a peach or a cold drink. We never made plans, but I came back anyway, every day for a week. I told myself it was just to help her settle in, but I knew that wasn't true. I was coming back for the way her eyes softened when she saw me, for the quiet way she made space for me without asking for anything. One afternoon, while she watered the plants lining her porch, I asked her if she'd always lived alone. She hesitated. The sun was setting behind her, turning the edges of her hair to fire. "No," she said quietly, "but I've gotten used to it." I didn't press her. I just nodded, because something in her voice told me that question had already cost her something to answer. Over the next few days, I started to learn her rhythms. She woke early, always barefoot, always quiet, like she was afraid to disturb the morning. She'd drink her coffee slowly, reading pages from the same old book she never seemed to finish. I started bringing breakfast sometimes, nothing special, just warm croissants or fresh fruit. She never asked, but she always looked a little less guarded when I did. She told me bits and pieces of her past, like someone laying out puzzle pieces without asking you to solve anything. She had been married once, briefly. "It didn't work out," she said, with a shrug that looked heavier than she meant it to. "He left before I could." There were no photos of him, no trace, really, that he'd ever existed in her life. But sometimes, when she looked at the wall too long or paused in the hallway like she'd forgotten where she was going, I saw the shadows of something unspoken, something broken and never quite mended. We built small rituals. She'd make us tea in the evenings, and I'd pretend not to notice how often our arms touched as we sat close on the couch. We didn't talk about the closeness. We didn't name it. It lived in the things we didn't say, in the way she leaned toward me when she laughed, or the way her eyes lingered on my hands when I fixed a loose handle on her drawer. There was a softness to the way she looked at me sometimes. Not longing, something quieter. Like I reminded her of something she thought she'd lost. One evening I stayed late helping her organize books in the living room. The air was warm, the windows cracked open, crickets murmuring outside. She handed me a stack of poetry books and paused when our hands touched. Neither of us pulled away. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even deliberate. Just a second too long. A shared breath. She looked up at me, her eyes darker in the lamplight. For a moment I thought she might say something, but she didn't. Instead, she walked to the other side of the room and began stacking more books, humming under her breath. A song I didn't know. Something wistful. When I finally stood to leave, she followed me to the door. The hallway light flickered slightly, and I turned to say goodnight. She stepped closer than usual, arms crossed lightly over her chest. I could see the freckles on her collarbone, the fine line of tension in her jaw. "Thanks for today," she said. "Of course." Her fingers reached out, barely touching my wrist, a whisper of contact, like a thought she changed her mind about halfway through. I looked at her, and she looked away. It was the first time I didn't want to go. The storm came suddenly, like it had been waiting just beyond the edge of the sky for the right moment. The air was thick all day, the kind that sticks to your skin, and by evening, the clouds broke open with a sound like something being torn apart. I was already at her place, fixing a shelf in the laundry room when the rain began hammering the roof. The lights flickered twice, then went out completely. She appeared in the doorway, holding 2 candles and a lighter, her face lit by a soft, flickering gold that made her look almost unreal. "Looks like dinner's going to be romantic whether we meant it or not," she said, half smiling. She had made pasta, simple, buttery, with herbs from the little pots on her windowsill. We sat at her small kitchen table while the storm roared beyond the walls, thunder rolling like distant memories trying to make their way back. The candle between us cast shadows on her face that moved when she breathed. There was a quiet between us that didn't feel like silence, just stillness. The kind that only happens when 2 people have slowly learned how not to fill space with noise. Her foot brushed mine under the table once, then again, and neither of us moved it away. She reached for her wine and looked at me for a long time before speaking. I used to think I'd get it right on the second try. I didn't say anything, just watched the way her fingers curled around the glass, like she needed something to hold on to. My first marriage, it wasn't what people think when they hear that word. There was no affair, no screaming, no slammed doors or broken dishes, just silence, slow unraveling. Her voice had softened, gone far away. He didn't see me. I mean, he looked at me, but I think he saw someone else. Someone I used to be. And I didn't know how to become her again. The storm cracked overhead. We both flinched, a little, and she let out a breathy laugh. Maybe I'm too used to disappearing. Even now, sometimes I walk past mirrors and forget to look. "I see you," I said quietly. I didn't plan to. The words just rose up and left me. She looked up at me, and something passed across her face. Not surprise exactly, but the kind of softness that follows a long-held breath, finally being released. She stood slowly, walked to the sink, her back to me. The sound of rain filled the room, tapping the windows in uneven rhythms. Her voice came again, low and uneven. "I think I stopped expecting people to stay a long time ago." I pushed back my chair and stood, unsure of what I was doing, but certain I needed to be near her. She didn't turn around, but when I stepped behind her, she didn't move. I reached out and gently placed my hand on her shoulder. Her skin was warm. She leaned back just enough for her head to rest lightly against me. Neither of us said anything. I turned her slowly, and when she finally faced me, her eyes were glassy with tears she hadn't let fall yet. I didn't wipe them away. I just stood there, letting her see that I wasn't leaving. Her hands found mine. No rush, no trembling. Just fingers intertwining, slow and certain, like we'd done this before in another life. The kiss happened so quietly I almost didn't notice. When it began, no surge, no hunger. Just the soft press of her mouth to mine, steady and real, like a vow spoken in a language only we understood. She pulled back an inch, eyes searching mine, and I saw it there. The question, the fear, the hope. I didn't answer with words. I just stayed. She led me to the couch and we sat together, her curled against me like something fragile that had learned to survive. I wrapped my arms around her, feeling the shape of her breath, the rise and fall of something that had long been buried and was only now beginning to surface again. The storm eased as night folded around us. The candles burned lower, flickering shadows across the walls. She closed her eyes and rested her head on my chest, and I let my fingers drift through her hair, gently, like I was learning her by touch. There was nothing to say, and everything to feel. The room smelled of rain and old wood and lavender. Her breathing slowed, and in that silence, thick with all the things we didn't need to speak, I felt something settle deep inside me. Not desire, not even love, yet just presence, and the kind of peace that comes when 2 people decide quietly not to be alone anymore. The days after the storm fell into a kind of rhythm neither of us planned but both leaned into. I'd show up around 9, sometimes earlier, with a bag of fresh bagels or strawberries. She'd already be awake, her robe tied loosely at the waist, feet bare against the cold tile floor. We'd sit on the porch steps with mismatched mugs, watching the street slowly come to life. She always took her coffee black. I added too much sugar. She teased me for it every time. We talked less and listened more, about the neighbors, the weather, the stubborn vines creeping along the garden fence. Her voice grew lighter, her laughter more frequent. But still, I caught her staring sometimes, when she thought I wasn't looking. A flicker of hesitation in her eyes, like she was waiting for something to end. One morning, while sweeping leaves from the porch, I found her sitting on the front step with a sketchbook open in her lap. She hadn't drawn in years, she said, but her fingers still remembered the shape of a line. I didn't say anything. I just sat beside her, watching the pencil move across the page like it had always belonged there. She showed me a drawing once, of me, from the back, sitting in her kitchen chair, reading. She'd captured the way I leaned slightly forward, elbows on the table, the way the light fell across my shoulders. It was the kind of detail you only noticed when you really looked at someone. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. I just reached over and took her hand. But something shifted in her after that. Not the way she touched me or smiled. That stayed. It was something quieter. Something in the way she pulled her robe a little tighter. The way her gaze sometimes lingered on the horizon too long. I felt it building like a tide. And one night, as we sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around both of us, she finally let it out. "You're going to leave eventually," she said, not looking at me. "People like you, they don't stay." I turned to her, confused. "People like me? You're young. You've still got things to chase. A world full of noise waiting for you to turn up the volume." She paused. "I'm not a chapter in someone's coming-of-age story. I don't want to be something you outgrow." I stared at her, stunned by the rawness of it. There was no accusation in her voice, just quiet resignation, like she was already bracing for the goodbye she hadn't heard yet. I didn't rush to answer. I just reached for her hand and held it in both of mine. "I never felt quieter than I do with you," I said. "Like the world finally stopped needing to be anything other than this. You don't feel like a chapter to me. You feel like the place I'd read over and over again." She didn't cry, but her throat moved like she wanted to. The next morning, I left before she woke. Not because I was running, but because I had something to finish. I spent the whole day at the hardware store, picking out the right shade of paint, a soft blue, almost gray, like the sky right before a storm. I bought brushes, tape, and new hinges too. Her front door had been sticking for weeks, and she never mentioned it, but I noticed. When I came back, she stood on the porch, arms folded, watching me set the supplies down. "What are you doing?" "Fixing the door," I said, "and giving it a new beginning." She didn't say anything, just came down the steps and stood beside me as I opened the can of paint. We painted together all afternoon, coats drying in the breeze, the old wood drinking in color like it had been waiting for someone to notice it again. When it was done, the door looked like something out of a home she'd only imagined for herself. Clean, calm, quietly beautiful. "I want you to see it every time you leave," I said, "and know I'm coming back." She leaned into me then, and I felt her whole weight settle against my chest. No words, just trust. As summer deepened, so did we. We fell into a rhythm of shared laundry loads, sun-warmed sheets, music playing softly from her radio in the kitchen. I'd read to her sometimes from the books I never finished. She'd sketch with the windows open, humming under her breath. There were no grand confessions, no dramatic declarations, just mornings, evenings, small gestures. My toothbrush next, to hers, her coat draped over my chair, our silences growing fuller, not emptier. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, I opened the front door and called her out. She stepped barefoot onto the porch, blanket around her shoulders, and looked up. Snowflakes drifted like whispers through the porch light, catching in her hair, her eyelashes. "It's snowing," I said. She smiled. "You stayed." I held out my hand and she took it. We stood there for a long time, watching the world go quiet under a soft white hush, two mugs cooling on the railing behind us, fingers laced like they always knew how to find each other.